All right, hello, ladies and gentlemen. So in today's video, we are talking all about burning calves while hiking up hills, and essentially what you can do if you really do struggle with your calves when you're on a lot of elevation hiking. And if you feel like your calves get tired, get tight, get sore, get fatigued, or whatever it may be, and we're going to be breaking this down in a bit of detail. Now, essentially, this particular video was inspired by a post that was popped up in our Facebook community. And was essentially asking, look, I've been weight training for several months, mostly to improve my hiking abilities. Still, while getting started hiking uphill, my calves are so tight and uncomfortable, and they really do feel like it's the weakest link. And the question was, should I start doing some more stretches to start? Is there any particular stretches I should be doing? And when I'm actually in the gym or doing my training, are there other areas I should be doing to focus on this and develop this? So when it comes down to this topic, there are a lot of factors that goes into this, and it's not really just a one-stop thing. And there's a lot of different things that can affect it. So I thought it was worthwhile diving into this in a bit of detail on this video. So with that being said, let's break things down a little bit more. So ultimately, when it comes down to calves on the trail, there are a few particular problems that kind of lead to this issue. Number one, the calves, so the lower limbs, those muscles on the back of your legs, below your knees, they are very, very important for hiking. However, for many, many people, they often get neglected in training. So many people just skip training this area when it comes down to if we're doing strength training or not, purely for the fact that it's not very exciting, it's a little bit boring. If we've been to the physio, the physical therapist, they probably asked us to do this type of stuff at some stage or another. And a lot of people are just really really training this area purely from a consistency sake. So a lot of people end up just having really, really severely under strength calves and really, really, really almost weak calves. And that can be a bit of an issue. Now, another factor that can kind of go into this is when we're looking at the hiking context, sometimes if we're training calves in a rehab setting or in a gym setting or in a home training setting, whatever it may be, sometimes the training that we do in these settings can be a little bit different than the actual needs we need for hiking. Because when it comes down to training calves, typically we'll do a few sets of 10 repetitions at a time, or maybe 15 at the very, very most, and we'll sort of do a few of those. But when we're actually out on the trail, if we're climbing up a big steep hill, we might be doing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of steps on those calves, and they end up cooking out. So sometimes there can be a little bit of a mismatch in regards to what we're actually doing with training and what we actually need for the trail. And then on top of this, when it comes down to this factor of the calves getting tight and uncomfortable and feeling weak, it's not just one thing usually. There are a few different factors that can goes into this. And we can typically see ankle mobility can be a factor, how much range of motion you actually have through the ankles and the mobility through the calves. Calf strength can be a factor in the actual ability of the calves to produce force. Calf endurance can be a factor, which is very similar to strength, but it is distinct in regards to the ability of your calves to produce a moderate amount of force continuously over and over and over. And also how you're actually hiking up hills can affect this. So all of these can sometimes be present in one person, sometimes it's one, sometimes it's two, sometimes a combination, or whatever it may be. So it does get a little bit complicated sometimes when we can look at these factors. Calves, often undertrained, sometimes not trained the right way, and there are a lot of different things going in. So with that being said, let me break this down for you, and we'll break down each of these areas and how you can kind of identify for yourself where you stand with all this and kind of what you want to be doing. So let's start with calf mobility. As I sort of said, ankle mobility, calf mobility, pretty much the same thing. Basically the ability of that joint to move and the tightness that you sort of get in the calves. A lot of people feel this tightness when they're hiking and they're like, oh, my calves are really, really tight. And they're like, you know what, I just need to stretch, I need to stretch, I need to stretch. Some people, that may be relevant. Some people, you may be getting tight calves, not so much for mobility, but because the muscle's simply not strong enough. So instead of just guessing this and trying to figure this out, we want to test this and kind of see where you stand. Now, a really, really simple way of going about this is doing something that's called the knee-to-wall assessment. And this is an assessment that I get all of my hikers to do. Essentially, what you want to do, you want to be barefoot. You want to get a ruler or a tape measure or something like that and set it up perpendicular to a wall. And then essentially what we want to do here is we get the ruler, we come up, put our foot down. And what we're looking at doing is keeping the foot flat on the floor and the heel flat on the floor. We want to push our knee into the wall. And essentially, if we can do that, then we just move our foot a little bit further out and then we push in. And essentially what we're trying to do with this assessment is trying to find the furthest distance your foot can be from the wall while you can still push your knee into the wall with the foot flat. So as I'm demonstrating this video here, we don't want the heel popping up. If it's popping up, that means you've gone too far. But we want to find the furthest distance your foot can get before it begins to start pop up. And then essentially what we want to do from there, once we've got that furthest distance, is we want to measure the distance between the big toe and the wall. That's kind of what we're looking at, and get that distance there. Now, realistically, for this particular assessment, the score that we're kind of looking for, if you can have a score of 10 centimeters or more, meaning if your toe is at 12 centimeters, 13, 14, 15, or whatever it may be, and you can push your knee comfortably into the wall without that heel popping up, that's usually a sign saying, look, you got a pretty good range of motion through the ankles, not that big a deal. And we can kind of say, you know what, it's probably other areas you want to work on. Alternatively, if you do this and you score less than 10 centimeters, so 9, 8, 7, 6, and you can't get any further without that heel popping up, that's usually a sign of saying, hey, this is probably an area we want to work on. And if you don't know centimeters, go to Google, figure it out with inches or whatever it may be, but that's kind of what you want to do. So 10 centimeters or more, you're pretty good. 9 centimeters or less, that's sort of saying, hey, we probably do want to concentrate a bit on extra stretching and mobility. And what we can look at here is if you are aware that, hey, it's tight, then it's simply a case of just doing some stretching, doing some through the week. And realistically, just fitting in some calf stretches. You can go on to Google, look them up, very, very straightforward, and fit them into your week. On top of that, you may also want to consider like, okay, if my calves are tight, over the long term, I'm going to try and improve that by stretching. However, immediately in hiking, I want to improve this. So you could do a little bit of calf stretching as a part of a warm-up. So, you know, one thing that I get my hikers to do is literally this knee to wall as a stretch. So we literally just push into the wall and out, into the wall, out, into the wall, out, do that like 10 on each side, get a bit of a stretch down here, can be pretty good. And that can be a nice stretch. And if that didn't make sense, go into Google, just type in knee to wall stretch and it will pop up. Another thing you can kind of try is doing a calf release. You can get like a water bottle and you can do this at the trailhead and essentially just rolling up and down on your calves. Do that for 60 seconds, 90 seconds. That can release things a little bit more. So ultimately, if you are a little bit tight there and you're aware that, hey, I didn't score very well, we essentially want to make sure you're doing plenty of stretching and mobility during your week to try to instigate a bit of a longer term change. And it may be worthwhile doing some warm-ups in your hiking on that area to help it feel a bit more comfortable. So that's our mobility. Next up, let's talk about strength. So essentially strength and endurance, again, we don't want to just go in and guess here. We want to make sure that we're actually aware whether this is good or not. So a really, really simple way of looking at this is doing what we call a single leg calf raise assessment. So very, very simple, super, super straightforward. Do this barefoot or in shoes, whatever you want. Leaning up against a wall, all we're doing is just basically pushing up into a calf raise, little pause at the top, and then come down. Essentially just making sure when you do this, you're not just bouncing around, so it's nice and controlled, and also make sure when you're doing this, you're kind of getting all the way up. So it's not just a little tiny little movement, but you're pushing all the way up. Now, this is a simple assessment, essentially what we want to look at here. Realistically, if you score, the clearance score we use for our hikers is 28 as a benchmark. So ultimately, if you score 28 repetitions, and you can do 28 repetitions of that, we're pretty good. And you can say, you know what, my calf strength is pretty good. Not to say it won't be beneficial to further improve that and keep on working on that, because that probably will be useful, but we're probably pretty good there. Alternatively, if you score less than 28 and say I can only do 10 repetitions or 12 repetitions or 15 repetitions before I get tired or before I get into pain, then that's a sign saying, you know what, our calves actually do need a little bit more work. And if we can improve that strength and improve that endurance, it's probably going to be really beneficial for on the trail. Now, when we are looking at calf strength, we want to be really, really smart about this. And let me pause the video. I'm going to pull up another picture. And one mistake a lot of people make with their calf training is a lot of us are very familiar with calf raises, just going up and down, up and down, up and down. But when it comes down to it, the calves actually have two muscles inside there. There's what's called the gastrocnemius, and let me pull up this picture. The gastrocnemius, which is essentially the muscles at the top of the calf, which a lot of us tend to feel when we're going through certain movements. And we can kind of feel that when we're hiking and this and that. Now, on top of that, there's also a muscle that's called the soleus, which is a little bit lower, a little bit deeper. And this one can be a little bit tricky to hit. So essentially, if we're trying to develop the strength in our calves, we want to make sure we're kind of getting both of those areas, because that will be very, very useful for our hiking. So essentially, how do you do it? Well, it's pretty straightforward. Straight leg to target the gastrocnemius is typically comes from what we call straight leg calf raises. So when we're going up onto our toes with our legs relatively straight. So a simple example of this could be this one. Could be this one. So basically, legs straight, we're on a little bench, and basically all we're doing, we're pushing up and then coming down. And pushing up and coming down, pushing up and coming down. Very, very simple. Now, this simple calf raise, it can be so many different adjustments. In this version, I'm off a step. I've got a pack on my back. You could do this one leg, two leg. You could do this body weight or with weights. You could do this from the floor or off a step. There's lots of different ways you can adjust this to get a good level for you. And that's a really, really versatile exercise that a lot of people can do. Now, another variation of this is if you're in a gym, you could do a seated leg press calf raise, where you basically just hop on a calf raise machine and you're basically just popping up onto your toes and down. Very, very simple, but very, very effective in the gym environment. Now, typically, I would probably do this a little bit slower than what's going on in this video, but it works out pretty well. So they're essentially muscles working that gastrocnemius, the top bit of the calf. Now, we also want to complement this with basically making sure we're working a little bit lower and making sure we're working on that soleus as well. And the way we do this is basically doing similar exercises, but the legs aren't straight, but the knees are a little bit bent. So for example here, let me pull up an example. This is one of my favorites, what's called a soleus calf raise. Or wall raise. So essentially you can see here the knee is bent and we're pushing up onto the toes. It will change the emphasis of the exercise very slightly and aim for that soleus a little bit more. Now in this variation, we're actually working the quads quite a bit as well. It's a nice way of getting a little bang for your buck exercise where we're kind of doing two things at once. But this is very, very useful. Or another example, you might do a seated calf raise where you're literally sitting down. Again, we've got a nice bent leg. We've got a weight here and we're pushing up onto the toe and then coming down nice and controlled. Pushing up onto the toe, coming down nice and controlled. Very, very, very effective. You can also do, if you're working in a gym, you could do the calf raise machine where you're sitting in a very, very similar movement to this, but you're actually on a machine. That works out pretty well as well. Now, if you are going about calf training, very, very, very simple. A few things I would recommend. Typically with calf training, I like slow calf training. So what I like to do is when we are going up, you go relatively quick on the way up. At the top, we have a little pause, so a little half second to a second pause, and then on the way down, nice and controlled. So any calf raises you're doing, little pause at the top, nice and controlled on the way down. And then one other thing that can be quite useful is having a mix of repetitions. So what I mean by that is occasionally doing 15 plus reps, sometimes doing 8 or less reps. So instead of just getting stuck on, hey, I'm going to do 10 repetitions and then rest, and then 10 repetitions and rest, get a bit of a mix of stuff that's slightly heavier and a little bit more strength-based and stuff that's a little bit lighter but a little bit more endurance-based. And essentially, if you can put that all together, that'll work out pretty well. So now we talked about calf mobility and calf strength. Next up, we want to talk about a bit more calf endurance. In the senses, as we sort of said before, sometimes there can be a little bit difference between purely just doing this sort of gym work and what we actually need for being on the trail. So a really, really simple way of developing this and filling this gap is actually training this in a certain way. And one really, really great way of going about this is fitting in some stair or hill sessions into your training, where essentially you'll find a local set of stairs or a local hill, and you'll literally do 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes even, of going up and down, up and down. In this particular way, you're training the body for these particular demands. Not only is it going to be really good for cardio, not only is it going to be really good for a bunch of different reasons, but this is going to be super, super useful for your calves, just to get them used to doing this again and again and again and again and again. So further down the line, when you're actually out on the trail, the calves are a little bit more used to this. Now, again, stair and hills are really, really versatile. You can do sort of slow, steady sessions where you're going really, really slow and steady moving up. You can do quicker sessions where you're kind of pushing the pace and using a bit more higher intensity. You can do a mix of those. You can make them a bit harder over time by adding extra time, using a steeper set of stairs, adding a bit of pack weight or whatever it may be. There's lots and lots of different ways of going about this. So ultimately, if you can look at a bit of strength as well as endurance combined, that works out really, really, really well. And the final thing I'll sort of cover on this particular video is hiking technique. And this is something that can be pretty relevant for your calves as well. In the sense that one natural way a lot of people will climb when we're going up hills, when we're going up stairs or whatever it may be, is we'll actually climb up and we'll be up on our toes. And we'll step and step and step and step and step while we're actually on our toes. Now that isn't usually a big deal if we're doing it from day to day in just our general day-to-day life. But if we're out on the trail and we're doing step after step, we're doing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of this, if we're actually up on our toes, what this does is it does put a huge amount of pressure through the calves, and that can lead to early fatigue, a little bit of tightness, and also sometimes for people who have sometimes get a bit of knee pain, this can actually be a big contributor for knee pain if we're just doing it again and again and again and again. So one thing I recommend exploring and experimenting with is, as opposed to just being up on your toes all the way through, is what we do what we call the heel push technique, where essentially what involves is when you're going up a steep hill or a steep set of stairs, as opposed to being up on your toes, you plant your foot, so the whole foot's on the ground, and try to put a little bit of weight through the heel. It doesn't have to be the whole weight. It's not like 100% of your weight is pushing through the heel, but a bit of weight. And what this can actually do is it can take pressure away from the calves, take pressure away from the knees, and actually get the hamstrings and the glutes, and maybe sometimes even the quads, doing a little bit more work, which can be really, really good for comfort, can be really, really good for performance, because ultimately those muscles are way, way bigger, way, way stronger than your actual calves. Now, this heel push technique, it may not be accessible all the time. Sometimes it's just too steep to do it. Sometimes you'll be on really awkward stairs or whatever it may be. So just fit in where you can. And even if you can get 10 or 20 or 30% of your climbing doing this, it can make a pretty big difference. The only thing I'll sort of say as well is if you do have quite tight calves and quite tight ankles, sometimes this can be a little bit tough to do initially. So this is just another reason to test this, see where it's at, and if it is a little bit tight, then make sure you're doing plenty of stretching to move that forward. And ultimately, when it comes down to it, once you sort of go through this and get a little bit logical and be like, hey, how does this all fit into my situation? We can identify areas that are going to be most beneficial for you to work on. And also this kind of builds out a whole bunch of things you can do, which will help the calves. But on top of that, all of this stuff I've mentioned is going to help you hiking in a bunch of different ways as well. So if you are aware that you do get quite tight calves, quite burny calves, quite fatigued calves, or whatever it may be, hopefully this video just gives you a little bit of insight into certain areas to look at. Hopefully it gives you a few, opens up this topic in a little bit of detail. If you did need a little bit of help with this, this is something we help hikers with all the time. So what I'll do is below this video, I'll leave a little link leave a little link for our online personal training for hiking programs. And if you were interested in getting a bit of extra help, you can check that out, see if it's something you might want to get involved with or whatever it may be. But with that being said, hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that helps people and hopefully makes a bit of a difference for you on the trail in the future.